To our next featured poet, PIp Osmond Williams, who is a poet, an editorial assistant, and an academic researcher from the north of England living in Glasgow. Her writing draws on nature and mythology to reflect on grief, love, and other aspects of human connection. In 2021, she won the Brian Dempsey Memorial Competition for her debut pamphlet of Algae and Grief, which was chosen as Poetry Book Society's Spring Pamphlet Choice in 2022. Now, of course, I also have a little reflection on your work, Pip, and I think of Algae and Grief as one of the most intriguing titles for a collection that I have come across. And it immediately sent my mind racing, like, are algae connected with grief, and how, or is it like two separate aspects that come to life in this collection? And then I started looking online for your poems, and I thought that actually the poems I read strengthened this idea of two-foldedness. For instance, the poem Winter Solstice 2020 mentions a bidding war and after parties, which are quite modern things, and also Mars samphire and rock salt. And I think this poem exists exactly in the stretch between and in the connectedness of these things. And it says the speaker says in the poem Yesnabi, I proclaim folklore is a fool's game. And yet the poem seems also steeped in old wisdom and in myth. And I think many of your poems are. And of course, wild, unruly women make appearances in these poems. Medusa, for instance, but also a wild woman in Amazon Woman. And that poem has the wonderful line, I have found new ways to tolerate salt, which I really love. And I think these poems also have found new ways to not just tolerate, but breathe life in the apparent contradiction that is our world. And okay, I have the same question for you that I asked Ingrid, spurred off by my Day of the Dead memorations, and also the theme of grief and loss in your poem. So I also want to ask you, what can a poem keep, or what can we retain in poetry that would otherwise be lost?
Well, thank you first for those lovely reflections on my work. Yeah, I really like this question, and I kind of came at it similar to Ingrid when you first said that you're going to ask us this, because I was thinking, one of the things I absolutely love about poetry is its ability to keep, the mundane and the ordinary. And one of the beautiful things about poetry is because it's in this contained space, you're elevating those ordinary things, and you get to keep them and make them precious, I suppose. But yeah, I think when I thought about it more, what I kind of always think of when I return to older poems that I've written is that they belong to a different self that I once was. And, we're always changing, but you don't notice that you're changing. And, I feel like I'm exactly the same as I was 10 years ago. But I go back to those poems and I'm think, oh God, no, that belongs to my 2016 self. And I remember what I was like and what I was putting into those poems, and how I was feeling and how I was trying to kind of, make a connection through that poems. But, that isn't who I am anymore, or, that part of the self has kind of been lost or has changed. So yeah, I suppose keeping your different selves and returning to them is something I think poetry can do. Yes, so I'm going to read from Of Algae and Grief, which was actually published around this time last year. So it's really nice to be here because it feels like a little birthday celebration for it. But yeah, I wrote a lot of these poems, well, probably from about 2018 onwards, but a lot of them were written in lockdown, when I've had a lot of time to focus on my writing. And yeah, I mean, personal grief is very much a thread that runs through, much of the collection, but I was writing it at a time of, very collective grief. And yeah, I suppose again, it's the idea of poetry. You're trying to make this kind of connection with the world. And yeah, it's pretty heavy in nature, birds. And I think it was just, being locked in my 4th floor tenement flat. I wanted to be in the outside world or feel like I could have been there. So a lot of the kind of feelings from lockdown come into it. And yeah, there's kind of there's kind of a trajectory to it, because you kind of the early poems have kind of more about anticipatory grief, and I suppose the actual, gut punch of death. But I wanted it to move into something more hopeful. And yeah, I suppose that kind of idea of the cycles of nature is something I take a lot of comfort in, and I wanted that idea of, we go through cycles and we have the peaks and troughs, and that's just a part of the rhythms of life. So yeah, I kind of was thinking about that when I was trying to decide which poems to read. So I'm going to read 2 from the kind of start of the collection first. First one is called Colony. As I say, birds feature heavily throughout these poems, so just expect them. Colony. The birds outside the window do not know that you're gone. Like eggs, we've stayed indoors for days, cradling grief as a moon in our arms who refuses to eat with us at the table. She doesn't sleep, so it's early when I dress myself in something like a Sunday best, take baby steps outside. A flash of blue, something blue. Air gathers in a cotton well upon my tongue. Times unstitched from my throat, their names you knew, but they live in my body like a harp. My hands are all stale bread and sour milk. I look to the birds, but for what? What is it that holds their hymns and wings aloft? Silence splits the lip, and in a bloody rush I say, I am with you in this time of sorrow. Hands in dripping mouth, I say, I am so sorry for your loss. They take 3 steps back, stare blankly from the holly bush. I've actually chosen to read this one, Yasnavi, which you mentioned, Miller, but I was thinking, because I'm sharing a stage with Ingrid, it'd be nice to have, actually Orkney does crop up quite a lot in my poetry, because my partner's from, the very north of mainland Scotland, so we go over to Orkney quite a lot. And I just remember this poem actually really comes from me first visiting Orkney, and he's, showing me all these wonderful places. And yeah, just thinking it's so magical, but then, when you're in the kind of, not the throes of grief by that time, but still, it's still kind of within you, and that kind of affects how you see things, and how you appreciate the beauty in the world. So yes, this is called Yasnavi, and Yasnavi is a lovely kind of hill cliff in Orkney. Yeah. I am trying to offer you something in return for Islay. All these splintered crags, flagstones of salt, blood and tar, your body in a shorefront bothy, the sweet half moon rising and falling beside herself above soft lines of the land. I am trying to peel myths and witches from my milk-thin throat to give to you, the sea-lashed boy. But each time I falter on unspoken words of the sea mother, old love that left on the southward equinox. Pushing the slip disc heart of mine away, I proclaim that folklore's a fool's game. Bring me the puckered lips of cowrie shells, the unsung joys of beachcombing. Primula scotica kissing our streaming feet, corn crate calls on coarse wind, distant Caithness and these open palms, coffee-soaked breath on a damp cheek. Easy with you to sift silver from salt. Know this, but still forgive me if I mistake sea stacks for thin folk fingers, an oyster catcher's wing for Hildeland, sea mist for gas rings I would stand beside with her when I was a girl. Some days, some clouds linger. Flotsam, jetsam, lagan, and derelict. So this next poem is from later. I think it's actually the final poem that I wrote for the collection, and it's called Migration. And yeah, when my brother and I, well, after our mum died and we were living back in the north of England, and it seems, again, I think it's lockdown now that this just seems crazy, but like we were surrounded by nature. We never wanted to go out in it. And we were just, you know, we stayed in the living room for like 2 years. And then lockdown hit in Glasgow and I was like, God, I just didn't appreciate what I had around me. But yeah, again, I think it's that idea of, you know, you missing what's beautiful in the world and all these wonderful things that show you about life returning. So yeah, this, I guess, it's about bird migration and yeah, starting to recognize or, you know, appreciate beauty in the world again after dark times. That first summer, we mistook their bodies for shrapnel. The second, their wings for a shiv. We lost faith in flight, forgot to seek hope in the shape of a bird, calling our names from the prayer wall to the west coast, swift and fleeting. We let slip what it's like to come home again, somehow fear it. A test, of course. That year, the earth bound our bodies quietly to its own. We did not feel it, but salt blood became sea foam, murmuring wet lines of swell and retreat. The windows were open. Something returned, brown-bellied, in a frenzy and drift. It looked like survival or celestial cue. It sounded like wings drumming in the north of the house. And I guess I've seemed to have chosen all the ones that you mentioned in your little intro. Yeah, I wanted to read Winter Solstice 2020, and partly because, you know, we'll soon be coming up to it. And I actually, considering I'm a very autumnal, wintry person, I actually don't write a lot about winter. But yeah, this was written at the end of 2020, and yeah, when I was writing it, well, I always say this when I read this poem, but it sounds very familiar, but we were in this very horrible cycle of failing politicians and watching the earth burn around us. And yeah, being in lockdown was just it's so difficult when you want to connect with other people and, you know, be part of life again, and you can't. So yeah, a lot of those feelings fed into this, but again, you know, I wanted it to be hopeful at the end. So yes, this is Winter Solstice 2020. after the smokestacks, after they stood in their wild silence, watching buildings burning through the long, dark half. After a bidding war erupted for scrubland, 3 parts fire, 1 part song. After they told us to stand tall, shoulder on, keep breathing normally. After the party, the after party, their dance to planes they never hear, now that they live under the flight path. After the last time, after the last time after time, last time after time, the last. Still, you wake dreaming of marsh samphire creeping through the fronds of your palm. Lemon verbena at the foot of the bed. Some things stay green in the heart. Some days we make the best of our bad lot. When the roads thaw, we'll leave the city. I'll kiss you beneath Kirvor again. Lick rock salt from the spindrift, become lugworm soft and split. From a sea-racked dune shell body, tremble the brief and silent promise. Lighter days are coming. I've probably used up my time now, so I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, are you sure you can do one more if you like?
Okay, well, I will say that I have barely written anything since I published my pamphlet. I'm incredibly in awe of people who can just write whenever they want to. I find it really difficult. So I'm starting to write a new sequence at the moment, but the only thing that I wrote this year really was a poem for my friend's wedding, and she asked me to read one of my poems, and I was like, oh, which one of my poems about grief would you like for your wedding? So I thought, oh, I'd better, write a new poem. And I'm not ever going to do anything with this. I gave it to her kind of as a gift. But yeah, so I'll just read this, seeing as it's my newest work. And it also doesn't have a title, so just call it Wedding Poem 1, because I'm sure they'll read more in the future. I'm at that age. Following nights lacking in sleep and faith, how sweet it is to wake and hear your voice like a summer bird, leading me, singing through the dark rooms of the house. Oh, and then to find you there in the kitchen, darling, in your crumpled shirt, with your patient hands. We learn to look for love in strange places, but I know it best beside you, weighing out ordinary days in sugar spoons. I'm told the years will take us by surprise, that one morning we'll wake with crooked knees. But today, the warm weather is holding, and you're at the door with the keys, saying, tell me what we need. I'll bring it back first.
Thank you so much.